They told us it was just a story, a forgotten superstition buried beneath layers of dust and denial inside the vast archives of the Vatican. But like all stories that were never meant to be heard, this one persisted. It refused to fade. The Prophecy of Saint Malachy is not some idle curiosity from the Middle Ages. It is a list, a warning, a final countdown carved into 112 cryptic lines, each pointing to the rise and reign of one single pope. And when that final line arrives, there are no more names, only silence and the end. The story begins in 1139. Saint Malachy, an Irish archbishop known more for his piety than for prophecy, journeyed to Rome. There, it is said, he was overcome by a vision so intense, so unrelenting, that it left him shaken to his core. What he saw was not heaven, nor angels, but faces. Flickering images of future men in white robes, popes, dozens of them. Each figure in his vision was accompanied by a phrase short, poetic, and deeply symbolic. These were not names. They were omens, clues, keys. He recorded them all, one by one. From Celestine II, who would succeed Innocent II shortly after Malachy's death, all the way to the last, 112 in total. The final line was different. It broke the rhythm of the others. In persecutione extrema, during the last persecution of the Holy Roman Church, Peter the Roman shall reign, and then the city of 7 hills will be destroyed. The dreadful judge will pass sentence, and the story ends. No more successors, no open future, only collapse, only judgment. This was not a cycle, it was a terminal prophecy. And for centuries, no one took it seriously. They called it a forgery, a clever manipulation written centuries later to influence a papal conclave in the 1500s. And yet, despite the skepticism, the lines began to line up. One phrase, one pope, over and over again, across the centuries. Descriptions that seemed too accurate to dismiss, too precise to ignore. By that count, if the prophecy holds, Pope Francis is the 112th, the last. Some argue about anti-popes, about disputed elections and political claims in medieval Europe, but even the most flexible interpretations leave us here at the end of the list. Pope Benedict XVI, the man before Francis, was linked to the phrase, glory of the olive. He came from the Benedictine tradition whose branch, the Olivitans, carry the olive symbol. And then came Jorge Mario Bergoglio, a man who chose the name Francis after Saint Francis of Assisi, a man known for visions of a church in ruin, a man who preached barefoot, who begged for the broken to be seen, who lived in simplicity. Francis is no ordinary pope. He wears no gold. He refuses the luxury of the apostolic palace. He chose humility over tradition. He speaks of mercy, of climate, of bridges between faiths, and yet he has no heir. There is no known successor, no cardinal being quietly groomed behind the curtain, only silence. When Benedict stepped down in 2013, it shocked the world. A pope had not resigned voluntarily for over 600 years, and on the night he departed, lightning struck the dome of St. Peter's Basilica. Not once, but twice. Some called it coincidence. Others saw it as confirmation. Francis emerged not with celebration, but under storm clouds. He stood on the balcony in silence, wrapped in white, barely smiling. And from that moment, his papacy marked a shift, not toward tradition, but toward transformation. He has embraced causes never touched by the throne before him. He speaks of fraternity, of poverty, of planetary survival. He prays in mosques, opens arms to atheists, and speaks of a universal human spirit, but there is one thing he does not speak of: the future. There is no signal, no name whispered through marble corridors, no hint of who would come next. And perhaps that's the most prophetic silence of all. The silence surrounding Pope Francis is not empty. It is loaded with implication. It carries the weight of something unspoken, something perhaps even forbidden to say aloud. In the long history of the papacy, every era has had its succession rumors. There were always favorites, always factions within the College of Cardinals vying for influence. But now, there is only stillness. No one dares to guess who might follow Francis. Because somewhere, deep inside the church, they suspect no one will. Not because of death, not because of war, but because the seat itself, this sacred throne that once commanded emperors and shaped nations, may be nearing its final hour, and perhaps, without saying a word, Francis knows it. He moves slower now. He speaks less. His presence, while still global, feels increasingly inward. He is not building something, he is winding something down. There are sermons, yes. Public appearances, yes. But beneath the surface there is an unmistakable mood of farewell. The church has entered a strange twilight, and with it, the papacy has become not a beacon of future direction, but a mirror reflecting the end of an age. What once stood as the center of Christian civilization now watches quietly as the world spins further away. The pews in Europe grow emptier each year. The West has turned from faith to spectacle, from gospel to algorithm. And still, Rome remains. But the walls are quiet, and the echoes grow longer. Saint Malachy's prophecy does not describe how the last pope will fall. It simply says he will reign during the final persecution. But persecution does not always arrive as sword and flame. Sometimes it comes in apathy, in irrelevance, in the slow forgetting of everything once thought permanent. Pope Francis speaks of these things, though not directly. He speaks of the environment, of displacement, of human suffering. But underneath those themes is another messageless visible, more urgent. He is preparing the faithful for something that cannot be said, not in doctrine, not in dogma, but in gesture. He strips away tradition, rejects the palace, refuses the title of monarch. He calls himself not the vicar of Christ, but the Bishop of Rome. A demotion? No, a revelation. Because if the throne of Peter is fading, then so too is the age that required such a throne. There was a time when the Pope was a king among kings. His word carried armies. His blessing drew lines on maps. But that time is gone. And Francis, unlike those before him, does not seem to resist that change. He accepts it. He walks alongside it. This is not weakness. It may be wisdom. The wisdom of a man who knows that resisting what must end only delays what must begin, and what begins next may no longer include a pope. There are those within the church who speak, quietly, of a post-papal future. A global communion of communities, decentralized, less hierarchical. A faith that no longer revolves around one man in white robes but many voices in many languages. This is not heresy. It is the future arriving early, and it has been arriving ever since Francis stepped onto that balcony without saying a word of triumph. He was not crowned. He did not raise his hands in victory. He bowed. A gesture so simple, so unassuming, and yet it told the entire story. This was not a pope who would reign. This was a pope who would close the chapter. Saint Peter, tradition tells us, died crucified upside down in Rome. He did not live as a prince, but as a servant. He built no palace. He left no throne. Perhaps, after nearly 2,000 years, the Church returns to that image, not as a loss, but as a kind of homecoming, a final act that echoes the first. And if that is true, if this truly is the last pope, then the question is no longer who will come after him. The real question is this: what is the Church without a pope? And are we ready to find out? There is a weight in the air now, around every appearance Pope Francis makes. It is not the burden of office she carries that lightly. It is the weight of transition, of knowing that the ground beneath is shifting, and that he is not standing in the center of a structure anymore, he is standing at its edge. Francis has not said he is the last. He doesn't need to. The prophecy speaks more clearly than any press release ever could. It said there would be 112 popes, and he is the 112th. There is no mention of a 113th. No words left. Only judgment, only fire. But perhaps that judgment is not wrath. Perhaps it is revelation. A church that began in shadows may return to them, not out of failure, but out of necessity, because the world that once required thrones and crowns now needs something else, something quieter, something deeper, something more rooted in soul than in structure. And this is what Francis may understand better than anyone. He does not resist the fading light. He walks into it willingly, not with fear but with purpose. He speaks less of dominance, more of dialogue, less of control, more of conscience. He does not shout, he listens. And the world, in turn, listens to him in a different way, not as a ruler, but as a voice from the ruins. The Church is not dying, but the form it once held, the monarchy, the pageantry, the centralized power, that form is dissolving. And there is no rebellion, no crisis, no enemy attacking from outside. The change is coming from within, like a candle burning not from the wind, but from its own wick. This is not collapse. It is transformation. But transformation always feels like death to those who only knew the old shape. It is easy to mourn what's leaving, harder to trust what's arriving, and yet that is the road we are walking now. Francis has hinted at these truths in his own way. He speaks of a church that must become smaller to become purer. A church that must shed wealth, influence, and politics to find its true soul again, not in palaces, but in the streets, not in rituals, but in mercy, not in titles, but in presence. He has faced criticism for this, from both sides. Some accuse him of abandoning doctrine, others accuse him of not going far enough. But perhaps they are both wrong. Perhaps Francis is not trying to fix the old church, but to prepare for the one that must come after. Even if no one wears white, even if no one takes the name Pope again, the world has changed, and the papacy cannot remain untouched. Digital borders, moral relativism, an entire generation raised with no memory of sacred things. In this world, the Pope cannot rule. He can only witness, and that may be the most sacred task of all. To stand not as sovereign, but as symbol, not as protector of tradition, but as a door to mystery, not as the head of an empire, but as the last voice echoing through a fading sanctuary. This is not defeat. This is offering. Malachy's prophecy ends with the fall of Rome. But what is Rome? Is it a city? A system? A spirit? When the prophecy says the city of 7 hills shall be destroyed, it might not mean literal fire. It might mean erasure of illusion, of permanence, of control. Because the church was never supposed to be about stone. It was supposed to be about light. And light, like faith, does not require architecture. It moves. It finds new vessels. It enters where it is welcome, even in the absence of hierarchy. And so the prophecy, far from being an omen of doom, may be an invitation, not to fear, but to awaken. If the papacy ends with Francis, then let it end not with fear, but with understanding. An understanding that every institution, no matter how divine its origin story may seem, is still made by human hands. And all human things must change, must dissolve, must return to the source from which they first emerged. Francis does not act like a man trying to preserve a throne. He acts like a man preparing others for the absence of one. He has not built monuments. He has not declared successors. He has written in sand, not in stone, and the tide is rising. There is a holiness in endings that few are willing to speak about, but it's there, in the surrender, in the letting go, in the final exhale before something ancient transforms into something unknown. That may be what we're seeing now, not destruction, but transfiguration. The church may not fall, but the version of it that held power for centuries, that gathered kings and ruled with doctrine and decree, that may quietly step off the stage. Not because it was defeated, but because its time has passed, because the world is now listening in new ways, and the divine, if it is to be heard, must speak a different language. And Francis old, soft-spoken, underestimated, might be the one chosen to say goodbye in that language. He never raised his voice. He never pointed fingers. Instead, he opened hands and opened doors. Doors not just to the church, but to something beyond it. He knows, perhaps better than anyone, that the institution cannot be saved by clinging to what it once was. It can only be reborn by remembering what it was always meant to be: a place of light, of humility, of truth told in silence. Not marble halls, not gold-trimmed robes, not Latin incantations whispered in shadowed cathedrals, but love, unshaped, unbranded, undenied. If that is what comes after the papacy, if that is the legacy left when no pope takes the throne again, then let it be. Let it come. Because the church was never meant to become an empire. It was meant to be a path, a guide, a living stream through every era-changing shape, flowing forward, never standing still. The throne of Peter was a moment in that stream, and it may now be dissolving back into the water. Many fear that loss. They fear what happens when the papacy ends, when there is no central voice, no symbolic father to anchor the faithful. But perhaps that was never the point. Perhaps faith was never meant to be anchored, only followed. And what happens now is not abandonment. It is freedom, not exile, but return. Return to the wildness of early belief, to the days when Christians gathered in caves, not cathedrals, when power was weakness and greatness was measured by how much you gave away. It may be that the next chapter will not be written in Rome at all, that it will begin in places no one is watching, in a home, in a slum, in a voice rising in the dark. The Spirit, after all, does not require permission to move, and it has always found its way into empty places. Perhaps Francis is the last pope because the world no longer needs a pope, not in the form we knew, not in the way we once revered. What we need now may be something simpler, something less visible, something truer. Not a crown, but a whisper. Not a throne, but a table. Not authority, but presence. What makes a pope, truly? Is it the vestments? The ring? The procession down the marble aisle beneath a dome that scrapes the sky? Or is it something else, something less visible, but infinitely more sacred? Pope Francis may be reminding us that the true authority of the Church was never in its gold, or its grandeur, or its global reach. It was always in its ability to be present where others fled, to speak where others stayed silent, to kneel where others demanded a throne. And now, with each year, each breath, he seems to lean more into that truth, not as a statement, but as a farewell. There are whispers that Vatican insiders already know what's coming, that some within the Curia suspect this will be the final papacy in its current form. They don't say it openly. They don't have to. The signs are everywhere. In the hesitation of their words, in the hollow echo of centuries-old rituals, in the sense that the Church is not preparing for succession, but for closure. When Pope Benedict resigned, it shocked the world, but his departure may have opened a door that cannot be closed again. He was the first domino. Francis may be the last, because after him, the old design may no longer function. The conclave may still meet, the white smoke may still rise, but the world will no longer watch in the same way. It will no longer believe with the same hope. A pope's power is not merely ecclesiastical, it is symbolic, and symbols, once cracked, do not easily repair themselves. Francis may not be ending the papacy deliberately, but by embodying something different, something lower, something humbler, he may be showing the world that the old model was always temporary. He leads by stepping back. He teaches by listening. He governs not by commanding, but by blessing. And in doing so, he may be making space for what must come next. Something leaderless, or leaderful. Something less defined by structure and more defined by spirit. The prophecy ends with fire, but not all fires are destructive. Some burn away what no longer serves. Some purify. Some illuminate. And in that flame, we may see not the end of the Church, but its beginning again. What if the real Church was never meant to be institutional? What if the entire experiment of hierarchy was a detour, a necessary one perhaps, for a time of kings and crusades, but no longer fit for this world? What if what comes next is a return to the firelight, to the circle, to the stories shared hand to hand, heart to heart, without microphone or robe or title? That is the legacy Francis might be preparing. Not a structure to preserve, but a soil to plant. He does not defend the walls. He opens the gates. He invites the wolves and the broken to enter not as threats, but as mirrors. He has been called naive, dangerous, even heretical. But perhaps he is simply ahead. Or perhaps he is simply the last one who still believes that endings can be holy, and that letting go is not loss, but grace. We have built so many expectations around power, even spiritual power. We imagine strength must look like control. That holiness must look like certainty. But what if the final pope is holy precisely because he lets it all pass through his hands? What if surrender is the most powerful act left? This is not weakness. It is trust. Trust that the Spirit knows where to go next, even if the world does not. And so perhaps Francis will not name a successor, not out of arrogance, but because he believes the next voice does not need to be appointed. It will simply rise. Like wind, like breath, like the echo of a prophet walking away from the palace for the last time. He does not slam the doors behind him. He leaves them open and waits to see who walks through. If the prophecy ends here, then perhaps it was never meant to predict disaster only, to reveal transition. What we thought was a warning might be a map, a quiet charting of a journey from hierarchy to humility, from empire to essence. There are those who will resist this interpretation. They will say the prophecy was misunderstood, that another pope will come, that tradition must continue as it always has. But what if tradition was never meant to be permanent, only purposeful? What if the prophecy wasn't about counting popes, but counting down? From the moment Malachy wrote the final line, something began, a fuse, a taper lit in silence. It passed from pope to pope across generations, through schisms and councils, through glory and scandal, until it reached its end. And at the end stands not a tyrant, not a warrior, but Francis, a man of worn shoes and tired eyes, a man who walks more than he rules, who speaks in gestures more than proclamations, who closes more doors than he opens, but only so that we might learn to build our own. In his final years, he has grown quieter, but his silence is not retreat. It is presence. It is the sound of someone who knows that sometimes the most sacred task is not to speak, but to listen as something greater takes shape. We look for thunder. We look for signs. We imagine that the last pope will usher in fire and flood and wrath, but the fire has already come, and it didn't destroy. It refined. It burned away the outer layers. It exposed the inner altar, the place where no title matters, only truth. Francis does not preach apocalypse. He preaches mercy. But even mercy, in its purest form, can feel like collapse to those who built their world on control. He speaks of tenderness as if it were revolution, because in a world built on steel, it is. If this truly is the lost papacy, it will not end with trumpets. It will end with a breath, a slow turning of the key, a light left on in the dark, and we will wake one morning not with announcement, but with absence, the chair empty, the doors open, the world continuing, and yet not unchanged. In the book of Revelation, the final judgment does not begin with war, it begins with silence in heaven, half an hour of stillness, as if even the divine must pause before what comes next. Perhaps this is that silence. Perhaps this is what Malachy saw, not flames, but the still moment before the new light breaks. Not destruction, not despair, but space, room for something not yet imagined, because the church has always survived, not by force, but by memory. And memory, like fire, moves forward only when it is shared. And so, Francis does not seal the vault. He opens it. He lets the air in. He lets the questions come. He does not answer all of them, but he blesses those who ask. This, too, is leadership, perhaps the highest kind. The question that echoes most now is not, who is next? It is, what remains? What remains when the rituals end, when the garments are folded away, when no one steps forward to claim the ring? What is left is what always mattered: compassion, truth, stillness, hope. The church is not dying. It is remembering. It is being stripped down to its bones. And there, in that rawness, something living still beats. Francis knows this. He sees that beneath every institution is a person, and that beneath every person is a soul. That is what the papacy was meant to serve, not to rule over, but to lift up. And now, in the twilight of his reign, he offers that truth without needing to defend it. He stands not in triumph, but in release, The throne behind him is no longer his burden, it is becoming empty. And perhaps soon, it will be gone. Not stolen. Not shattered. Just unneeded. So what does it mean if Pope Francis is truly the last? What happens when there is no white smoke, no conclave, no new name spoken beneath the Sistine ceiling? The answer may be simpler than we thought. Life goes on, and so does faith. But it will go on differently. The pageantry will fade, the silence will stretch. The world may ask questions, some in mourning, some in anger, some in hope. And slowly, we will realize that the absence we feared has become a doorway. Not a void, but a threshold. The seat is empty, but the spirit is not gone. In small corners of the world, something new will begin. It may not call itself a church, it may not have robes or incense, but it will carry the same fire. The fire that first lit the hearts of those who walked with no temples, who gathered around meals, not altars, who knew that truth did not need walls. The prophecy ends with judgment. But judgment does not mean punishment. It means reckoning, recognition, clarity. It means the end of illusion. It means seeing at last what really mattered. For centuries, the Church believed that without a pope, there would be chaos. But perhaps it is the opposite. Perhaps, without the weight of papal identity, something more agile, more honest, more deeply human can rise. Perhaps we will no longer look up, but across, at each other, at the world, at the divine hidden in the everyday. The last pope, then, is not a failure of history but a fulfillment, the final act in a play that was never about power but about transformation. Francis will leave behind no empire, no marble legacy, but maybe that is the point. Maybe the greatest act of faith is to leave empty hands and trust that what is needed next will come. So let the chair remain unfilled. Let the white robes hang quiet in the dark. Let the Vatican fall into shadow if it must, because light does not need high places to shine. It only needs someone willing to carry it. And those people are already out there, in slums, in kitchens, in forgotten fields, in crowded cities. They do not need thrones, they do not need titles, they need courage, they need clarity. They need truth spoken gently and lived fiercely. That is the legacy now. Not a successor, but a million small fires lit by one man's quiet refusal to be king. Francis was not Peter the Great. He was Peter the listener, Peter the last, Peter the bridge. And now that bridge has been crossed. There may never be another like him. There may never be another pope, but there will be something freer, something closer, something we can no longer call the church because it will be something deeper. Malachy's final line spoke of persecution. And yes, there will be trials. There always are. But the real trial is not external. It is within. Will we cling to what was, or open to what may be? Will we grieve a throne or greet a dawn? Because maybe the last pope's job was never to hold power, but to give it away. And maybe, just maybe, that's what he's done. Stay until the end. You just did. Subscribe for more stories that history tried to erase.